Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This week you sent over a bunch of sources about learning and studying. Really interesting stuff. And one thing that really stood out was this kind of puzzling question, like, why do students often avoid a learning technique that's been shown to be super effective? By over a century of research, no less.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Today, we're really going to dig into this whole idea of retrieval practice. Why don't students use it more when they're studying on their own? And what does the latest research say about what might actually encourage them to use this strategy, which is, as you said, really effective?
It really is a bit of a head scratcher, right?
This technique, retrieval practice, basically just actively recalling information from memory, has this amazing track record, like one of the articles you sent a review by Carpenter in Educational Psychology Review from 2023, points out that over 100 years of research supports just how effective it is. In boosting student learning, I mean.
Yeah, definitely. And to add to that, there was this systematic review by Agarwal and a few others back in 2021. They looked at all this research done in schools and classrooms, and their findings consistently showed that retrieval practice really does benefit student learning across lots of different educational settings. So the evidence is pretty solid.
I mean, with evidence like that, you'd think students would be all over it.
Hmm.
But as that Carpenter review highlighted, there's this weird paradox. Even when students know about these benefits, even if they've experienced them firsthand, it doesn't automatically make them choose retrieval practice, when they're studying on their own.
Yeah, and this brings us to a really important point, especially now with education putting more and more emphasis on this idea of self-regulated learning, basically students taking more control of their own learning journey. So understanding why students make the study choices they do becomes even more important.
For sure. We need to unpack this disconnect between what we know works and what students actually end up doing. And the Carpenter review you shared really dives into this. They looked at a whole bunch of emerging research on interventions, things designed to encourage students to actually use retrieval practice. So that's our mission today, to break down those insights for you guys so you can understand this whole thing better. And hey, maybe even apply some of these findings to your own learning or help others with it. So the review looks at a few different types of interventions, and we'll get into those soon.
Exactly. And as that research shows, just telling students, hey, retrieval practice is good for you, doesn't usually get them to change their habits.
Right. Okay. But before we jump into all that, let's just back up a sec. For anyone who might not be totally familiar, can we just go over what we actually mean by retrieval practice, just to be sure we're all on the same page here?
Of course, of course. At its core, retrieval practice is basically trying to actively recall information that you've already learned, trying to pull it out of your memory. This could be things like answering practice questions or trying to summarize material without looking at your notes. Even just going over key concepts in your head, the key is that you're actively working to bring that information back to mind. And it works so well because that active effort to pull stuff from memory strengthens those neural pathways, makes that knowledge easier to access later. Think of it like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Makes sense. So it's not just about passively rereading notes or highlighting stuff. It's really about engaging with the material and testing yourself to see if you actually get it. And like we already said, the evidence for it is super strong. The Carpenter review, along with that Agarwal study, really make that clear. But here's where things get really interesting. Even with all that proof, students often don't choose to use retrieval practice when it's up to them to study. So why is that?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The Carpenter's review really highlights this tendency, students not choosing retrieval practice on their own. And this is especially important now with education becoming more self-directed. If students aren't using good strategies like this independently, it can really affect how well they learn.
It's like there's this gap between what they plan to do and what they actually do.
Mhm.
I remember the review mentioned research by Blossman and others from 2017. They found that what students intend to do when studying and what they actually do can be two totally different things.
Exactly. They might get that retrieval practice is beneficial, but when it comes to actually sitting down to study, they might choose things that feel easier or more comfortable in the moment, even if those strategies don't help them learn as well in the long run.
So to recap, retrieval practice good, students not using it enough, and just
Mhm.
telling them it's good, not doing the trick. The Carpenter review makes that pretty clear.
Right. Even giving students direct experience with retrieval practice doesn't guarantee they'll use it on their own. That's a really important point. You'd think that if students try it out in class and see how well it works, they'd naturally gravitate towards it when they're studying solo. But the research suggests that's not always the case. They can recognize that it's effective, but they don't always make that jump to actually using it regularly.
So what does work? I mean, the review did talk about some promising strategies, some interventions that seem to help. So let's get into those. The first one that caught my eye was this idea of making retrieval practice feel less difficult, reducing the effort and the potential for errors. How does that make students more likely to use it?
It's interesting. This one's all about the psychology of learning. Research suggests that if students think retrieval practice is going to be too hard, or if they think they're going to make tons of mistakes, they're less likely to even try. So, by making it easier at first, maybe starting with simpler questions or giving them hints, you can lower that barrier to entry.
Right, sort of like easing into a workout. You wouldn't start with the heaviest weights right off the bat. So in learning, maybe that means starting with broad overview questions before getting to the really detailed stuff.
Exactly. If those first attempts at retrieval feel less overwhelming, students are more likely to experience a sense of success, and that can make them want to keep using the technique. It builds their confidence and reduces those negative feelings that come with struggling to remember something.
Makes a lot of sense. The second strategy they highlighted was giving students direct feedback on how they're doing with retrieval practice. This seems really crucial. Why is getting that feedback so motivating?
Well, if we think about the bigger picture of learning and how we learn to control our own learning, feedback is essential. When students get specific feedback showing them how retrieval practice has helped them learn better, for example, by comparing how they do after using retrieval to how they do after just rereading, it makes those benefits way more real and relevant to them personally.
So it's not just about knowing it works in general, but seeing how it works for them specifically.
Exactly. The Carpenter Review actually mentions this study by Huey and some other researchers in 2021. They specifically looked at how individual performance feedback can make students more likely to use retrieval practice. When students can actually see that direct impact on their own learning, they're more likely to see the value of it and use it again.
That connects to something else the review mentioned. The fact that students can recognize effective learning strategies, like Rhea and colleagues talked about in 2022, but they don't always actually use them. Seems like that personalized feedback could be what helps them bridge that gap between recognition and implementation.
You're totally right. The feedback gives them that concrete proof. It makes the benefits less abstract and more personally convincing. It helps them move past just knowing that retrieval practice works to actually understanding how it works for them.
Now, the review also talked about these multifaceted interventions, approaches that combine a bunch of different elements. So what would that look like in practice? And why are these kinds of interventions showing promise?
This brings up an interesting point. Changing study habits is complex, and multifaceted interventions recognize that just addressing one thing, like giving information or making things less difficult, might not be enough. So these approaches use a combo of strategies. This could be things like directly teaching students about retrieval practice, helping them plan how to work it into their study routines, giving them chances to practice it over time, and then encouraging them to think about the results they see.
So a more holistic kind of approach. The review brought up this thing called the Start and Stick to Desirable Difficulties, STD2 framework by De Bruin and some others. Does that tie into this idea of multifaceted interventions?
Yeah, it does. The STD2 framework emphasizes not just introducing students to effective strategies, even if they might be a bit challenging, hence the desirable difficulties, but also giving them the support and guidance they need to actually adopt and use those strategies over time. This often includes things like planning, self-monitoring, and reflection, which all fit really well with the concept of multifaceted interventions.
And the review also mentioned learning strategy training programs. It pointed to studies by Buer and colleagues, as well as McCabe and Tricio. How do those programs fit into this whole puzzle of encouraging retrieval practice?
Well, these training programs are usually designed to equip students with a whole range of effective learning techniques, including retrieval practice. But they go beyond just explaining the benefits. They provide really clear instruction on how to actually implement these strategies well. And some programs also include elements of planning and self-reflection, with the goal of helping students make these techniques a regular part of how they study. Research indicates that these more comprehensive approaches can have a positive effect on how students study and even their grades.
So it seems like a more sustained and supported effort might be what's really needed to change those ingrained study habits. Now, the review did bring up some nuances and things to consider too, right? It wasn't all just success stories. There was this follow-up study by Kirk Johnson and colleagues that didn't find a significant difference between retrieval practice and restudy under certain conditions. What was happening there?
That study highlights a really key point. The context of retrieval practice matters. They found that when the text passages were hard and initial retrieval success was low, around 55%, and there wasn't any corrective feedback given during that first attempt at retrieval, the benefits weren't as clear compared to just restudying. So it seems like if retrieval practice is too challenging right away and students aren't getting feedback to guide them, it might not be that effective, and it could even discourage them.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of goes back to that idea of desirable difficulties that the review talked about, referencing Bjork and Bjork. Can you explain that a bit more? Sounds like there's a sweet spot when it comes to challenge and learning.
Definitely. Desirable difficulties. Basically, the idea that some level of effort and challenge during learning can actually help you remember things better in the long run. But the key word is desirable. If it feels way too hard or impossible, like maybe it did in that Kirk Johnson study with the tough text and no feedback, it can backfire. Students might avoid strategies that constantly lead to frustration and mistakes, especially without any guidance. To give you an example, imagine trying to recall really complex formulas right after seeing them just once. That could be too much. But trying to recall key terms and concepts, that might be challenging but still doable and actually helpful.
So it's about finding that right level of challenge, enough to make learning stick, but not so much that students give up before they even start. The review also briefly mentioned curiosity and feedback. Referencing work by Mullaney and colleagues, how does curiosity play into all of this?
Well, research suggests that curiosity can make students more motivated and engaged in learning. When they're curious about something, they might be more willing to put in the effort needed for retrieval practice, especially if they know they'll get feedback that satisfies that curiosity and helps them understand the material better. The anticipation of getting the answer or clearing up their confusion through feedback can be a really strong motivator.
That's a fascinating angle. And the review also pointed out that how often students say they use retrieval practice can change depending on their age and what subject they're studying, citing Tullis and Maddox. What's the takeaway from that?
It shows there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to retrieval practice. Younger students might use it differently than older students, and how relevant or useful retrieval practice seems might depend on the subject. For example, it might feel more natural to use retrieval practice for learning vocab in a language class than for solving tough math problems, even though it can be helpful in both.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. The benefits of retrieval practice, why students avoid it, some promising strategies to encourage them to use it, and some important nuances to keep in mind. So what are some key takeaways for educators listening in, or even for anyone thinking about their own learning?
Based on the research, there are a few simple things you can do to encourage retrieval practice. First, when you're designing those initial retrieval activities, it's important to make sure they're not too difficult or likely to lead to lots of mistakes. Maybe start with easier questions, give them some hints or cues, or break down complex information into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Right, so make it less daunting right out of the gate. Lower that barrier to entry.
Exactly. The second thing is providing clear and timely feedback that directly shows how beneficial retrieval practice is. Maybe show students how much better they do after using retrieval compared to other study methods. Making those improvements obvious and connecting them to retrieval practice is a really powerful motivator.
So explicitly show the link between effort and results.
Yep. And lastly, using those multifaceted approaches seems to be really promising. Don't just tell students about retrieval practice, guide them on how to plan for it. Give them regular opportunities to practice, and encourage them to reflect on how it's affecting their learning.
That more comprehensive strategy makes a ton of sense. The review also mentioned some specific tools that could help, like online quizzes or prompts.
Oh yeah, technology can definitely be helpful here. Online quizzes that give immediate feedback, or even those automated prompts that remind students to recall information every so often. Those can be great ways to incorporate retrieval practice more smoothly into learning. The review mentions some examples like work by Carpenter and colleagues from 2017, Cleary and colleagues from 2021, Pan and colleagues from 2019, and Walk Shannon and colleagues from 2019. They all explored using tools like that.
So it's all about making it easier to use, showing how effective it is, and integrating it into the learning process in a structured way.
That's a great summary of the key takeaways.
Well, this has been a really fascinating look at why we don't always do what we know is good for us when it comes to learning, and specifically what might help bridge that gap when it comes to retrieval practice. So just to recap, we know retrieval practice is powerful, but getting people to use it takes more than just explaining why it's good. It seems to come down to reducing those initial hurdles, giving clear evidence of its effectiveness through feedback, and taking a more well-rounded, multifaceted approach to making it part of the learning experience.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a final thought to leave you with. We know that students, and even teachers, can sometimes misjudge how well they're learning or teaching, like Carpenter and colleagues pointed out in 2020B. So how can people get better at recognizing and embracing effective learning strategies like retrieval practice, even when those strategies might feel harder or less obvious at first?
That's a really powerful question. It makes you think about how you can be more aware of your own learning process and how you can be more open to strategies that have a lot of research backing them up, even if they don't always feel like the easiest option in the moment. So thanks for letting me dive into these sources with you. I hope these insights are helpful as you continue your own learning journey, or if you're helping others learn too.